They called it the workhorse of the Wehrmacht. They called it the backbone tractor of the German army. They called it the universal artillery hauler. But American GIs had only ever seen the SdKfz the way a hunter sees a deer at a distance. They saw it on roadsides abandoned. They saw it in reconnaissance photos. They saw it in technical manuals. They saw it through binoculars. They saw it burning in the fields of Normandy. They saw it stuck in the mud of the Ardennes. They saw it derelict outside Cannes. But they had never driven one. Not really. Not with their own hands. Not with their own foot on the throttle. Not until the spring of 1945. Spring comes late in Northern Europe. Cold mist still clings to the Rhine in March. The ground still holds winter inside it. Mud still has that heavy brown weight that kills traction. And in that gray, cold, diesel-smelling, oil-soaked war spring of 1945, the U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to cross the greatest river barrier in Central Europe, the Rhine, the door to the heartland of the Reich, the bridge to the industrial core of Germany, the line that Hitler had promised would not be crossed. But it was being crossed, every hour closer, every day tighter. And inside that massive logistical hurricane, inside those fuel dumps, pontoon piles, Bailey bridge kits, artillery park-ups, spare parts depots, ammunition stacks, engineer company revetments, an ordinary ordnance captain came across something that would end up teaching the American Army something no intelligence report had ever told them. Not about tanks, not about guns, not about tactics, about fuel. About gallons per mile, about the invisible arithmetic that wins or loses wars. Fuel is not romantic. Fuel is not dramatic. Fuel is not what people imagine when they think of the rise or fall of armies. People talk about Tiger tanks and Messerschmitts and SS Panzer Grenadiers. People talk about the noise of the Nebelwerfer and the scream of a Stuka siren. People talk about armor penetration tables. But in war, the thing that decides whether a tank gets to fire at all is whether it even arrives. And arrival depends on fuel. Every gallon burned is a mile gained or not gained. A battalion without fuel is not a battalion. It is a parking lot of metal. American planners had known this even before Pearl Harbor. They had known that every gallon shipped from Texas had to survive a U-boat gauntlet of the entire Atlantic. They had known that every gallon that reached Cherbourg or Le Havre had to ride an endless chain of trucks to the front. They had lived the Red Ball Express. They had lived the nightmare that mobility is not about horsepower. Mobility is about logistics. And so the American vehicles had been designed by engineers who understood that the customer was not the driver. The customer was the supply officer. And if the supply officer could not feed the machine might as well have been a sculpture. The M3 half-track was the proof of that philosophy. It was not glamorous. It was not exotic. It was not over-engineered. It was a very American machine. It was a truck turned into a light-armored personnel carrier. It used an engine that was not some special wartime unit. It used an engine that came right off the American commercial truck assembly line. It was mass production incarnate. It burned roughly 3 to 4 miles per gallon on roads, which was terrible by civilian standards, but it was efficient by military standards. It was designed to take a platoon of infantry from point A to point B without draining a division's daily allocation of gasoline. It was designed to tow light to moderate guns without requiring a fuel truck to babysit it. The German SdKfz was another idea entirely. It was not a mass production product of a capitalist truck industry. It was not designed to be cheap. It was not designed to be fuel efficient. It was designed in the 1930s, during the era when Nazi planners imagined war as something that would be short, violent, decisive, and fuel-rich. The German army believed that war would end before fuel became a constraint. The Maybach HL62 and HL64 engines inside the SdKfz were technological ego pieces. They were built to haul the heaviest guns of the Wehrmacht. They were built to tow 88s. They were built to tow 150mm howitzers. They were built to drag heavy iron across mud. But they were not built to sip fuel. They were built to guzzle fuel. They were built on the assumption that Germany would always have fuel. By late 1944, Germany did not. By late 1944, Germany's fuel dreams were gone. Synthetic fuel plants were burning. Ploesti was gone. Oil was rationed. Tanks were parked. Panzer divisions were immobile. Horse wagons returned as if the world had reversed technologically 50 years. But the SdKfz still had their hungry engines, and those engines still burned fuel at a rate that was shocking. Even under ideal circumstances, the SdKfz-7 barely touched 3 miles per gallon. Under combat conditions, under mud, under loads, it could do 1 mile per gallon. 1. And this is where the story becomes human. Because for American GIs in March 1945, the SdKfz-7 was not a theoretical machine. It was a real machine sitting right in front of them. A line of them, abandoned, nearly intact, just sitting there. Mud on their tracks, German grease on their bolts, German markings still on the instrument clusters. The German war machine had simply run away from them because they had no gas left to drive them. These machines had not broken down. They had simply starved. The ordnance captain decided to use them anyway. The engines ran on gasoline, so just fill them. The American fuel truck topped them up with American gasoline that had come from oil fields half a world away. And the Americans got inside these captured beasts. The first impressions were glorious: power, torque, traction. A vehicle that pulled artillery like a locomotive. Men wrote home saying this thing felt like a monster. Drivers were smiling. Officers were impressed. For 48 hours. Then they began noticing the fuel gauge dropping at a ridiculous speed. They could not believe it at first. They thought they had misread the tank fill. They thought maybe the tank was not topped off fully. They checked for leaks. They checked the fuel lines. They checked the carburation. They checked the choke. They checked everything a motor sergeant checks when consumption looks wrong. But there was no problem. The problem was the design. The engine was doing exactly what it was engineered to do. It was consuming the fuel it needed to drag that tonnage across mud. In 2 days, the SdKfz-7 fleet was demanding fuel like vampires crave blood. So the captain did the only rational thing. He did a controlled test. One M3, one SdKfz-7, same route, same weight, same conditions, same weather, same loads, same driver skill. When they returned, the M3 still had fuel in the tank. The SdKfz-7 was bone dry and had burned 63 gallons in 65 miles. That number stunned every American officer who saw it. It implied that if the U.S. Army had owned these vehicles instead of the M3, then the daily fuel requirements of a mechanized artillery battalion would have doubled. Doubled. Not 10% more, not 20% more, twice as much. And in a war where the limiting factor of everything is not manpower or steel or training but gasoline, that difference is not minor. That difference is decisive. And suddenly the American soldiers understood something fundamental about why Germany was collapsing. German tanks were brilliant. German guns were brilliant. German engineering was obsessive. But German vehicles were designed during a national hallucination that fuel would never be scarce. They were designed for a war that would be quick. They were designed for a war that would conquer new fuel sources before the old ones ran out. But the war did not end early, and the fuel did not hold, and the synthetic plants could not be rebuilt faster than they were bombed. And the oil never came, and the brilliant machines became useless. The SdKfz-7 was not unreliable. It was unsustainable. That was the hidden weakness. And American soldiers driving these captured machines in March 1945 could feel that weakness physically. They could feel it in the way the gauge would drop like a stone. They could feel it in the way they had to stop twice as often as their own vehicles. They could feel it in the way every convoy had to include a fuel truck dedicated to these German machines alone. They could feel it in the way the war had not ended because German tanks had been blown up but because German tanks had simply stopped moving, and this was just the beginning of what these GIs would discover about the German war machine in the final weeks of the Reich. Over the next days, the story repeated itself again and again. American units using captured German vehicles were seeing the same strange pattern. You could have a brilliant, powerful, rugged machine under you. You could have torque that impressed even veteran truck drivers. You could have traction that bit into mud like a steel animal. But the machine was devouring its own future with every mile. Every mile was a blood transfusion of fuel, and the closer the Americans got to the Elbe, the clearer the pattern became. German vehicles were not victims of breakdowns. They were victims of starvation. Elements of a tank wrecker unit tried using a captured German heavy recovery tractor to drag damaged Panther hulls. The Americans were amazed. The German machine pulled disabled Panthers and Panzer IVs more confidently than the American M32 wrecker could pull a single Sherman. It was like the German vehicle was born to drag steel. But then the Americans saw the absurd catch. That German wrecker drained its tank so fast that fuel trucks had to trail it, like supply nurses trailing a wounded patient on a stretcher, holding the IV bag so it did not run dry. What good was that power if every 30 miles it turned into an anchored monument needing another refill? In an artillery battalion, the same phenomenon appeared. They hitched their 105mm howitzers to 2 captured SdKfz 07s because the mud was deep and the M3s struggled. The German tractors walked right through that mud like they owned it. Officers were impressed. Men were impressed. But those German tractors needed refueling constantly. The battalion soon calculated that for every 1 German tractor they used, they had effectively added the fuel burden of another entire half-track just to feed it. Tactical advantage in traction canceled by strategic disadvantage in supply. And all over Germany that April, American soldiers started to understand the deeper meaning. Germany's defeat was not just bullets and bombs. It was arithmetic. German doctrine had been brilliant at the level of maneuver. But the machines themselves had been built like aristocrats. They were noble thoroughbreds, not farm horses. They needed constant feeding. They needed perfect conditions. The Maybach engines in Tigers, Panthers, and these half-tracks were not engines for a 6-year attritional war. They were engines for a blitzkrieg that was supposed to end in oil fields by the summer of 1942. But the war did not obey that fantasy. Panzer divisions in 1945 were not destroyed by enemy tank fire in most cases. They simply never had fuel to move. There are U.S. after-action reports describing entire columns of German vehicles, intact, abandoned on roads, wheels still straight, hatches still closed. No shell holes, no fire damage, no battle scars. The only damage was the absence of gasoline. The U.S. Army mechanically inspected dozens of these abandoned machines. And they found the same repeating theme. The hardware was good. The materials were good. The engineering was excessive but technically impressive. But the reality was that the fuel tanks were too small for the consumption rates. They were sized for the wrong war. At the same time that Americans were feeding gasoline into these German monsters, just to keep them moving for tests, the German army was reduced to horse carts. Horse carts in 1945. In the heart of the country that had invented the modern internal combustion engine. That was the most poetic condemnation that any engineer could have imagined. The Germans had built a war machine for a war that did not exist. Meanwhile, American mechanization was not glorious, but it was survivable. The American engines were not designed to show off. They were designed to produce results per gallon, not per moment of acceleration. They were built for campaigns that were long. They were built for campaigns where the supply line stretched across continents and oceans. That was the difference. One side engineered for power, one side engineered for distance, and distance won the war years later. When historians and armchair analysts tried to summarize why the German war machine failed, they pointed to Hitler, or Stalingrad, or Kursk, or D-Day. They pointed to wrong strategy. They pointed to bad high command decisions. And those factors mattered. But American GIs who physically touched these machines in March and April 1945 knew something more grounded. They knew the enemy lost because the enemy machines could not sustain themselves. It was not that the Germans could not design. It was that they designed without obeying the governing law of war. The supply line decides the distance your ideas can travel. In the final weeks, U.S. soldiers saw German towns filled with vehicles that would never move again. Not because their engines were dead, but because there was nothing left to feed them. They had become statues. They had become display pieces of an ideology that dreamed too big and calculated too little. That is why one ordnance officer in the 9th Army wrote in his report something that would later become legendary among logistics historians. He wrote, "German engineering was like a lion with no stomach, because a lion with no stomach eventually dies not from the claws of another lion, but from hunger." And in those April days in central Germany, that hunger was visible in every roadside half-track, every silent tiger, every fuel-starved panther, every abandoned motor pool. The war had ended for the Wehrmacht not when their tanks were knocked out, but when their FE